Hello everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Tonight we're diving into 3 of the most unsettling real-life crime stories in modern American history. 3 cases that shook entire communities and left behind questions that still linger in the air like cold breath on a winter night. First, the story of Philip Markoff, the man the media called the Craigslist Killer, a medical student with a flawless future ahead of him, and a hidden darkness no one saw coming. A case that began with a single suspicious meeting arranged online and spiraled into something far more chilling. Then, we'll explore the heartbreaking and deeply disturbing case of Susan Smith, the mother whose desperate cries for help captured the sympathy of an entire nation, before the truth revealed a far more tragic reality than anyone expected. And finally, the shadow that haunted Boston in the early 1960s. The Boston Strangler, a series of murders that plunged a whole city into fear, suspicion, and sleepless nights. We'll follow the twists, the confessions, and the unanswered questions that still send shivers down the spine. These stories aren't just about crime. They're about the masks people wear, the secrets they hide, and the darkness that can live where you least expect it. If you enjoy deep dive true crime documentaries like this one, make sure to leave a like and don't forget to subscribe. It really helps the channel grow and allows me to bring you more stories just like these. Now, let's begin. When people think about danger on the internet, they imagine dark alleyways of the web, hidden forums, encrypted chats, places far from everyday life. But back in 2009, the threat was hiding in plain sight. On a website millions of Americans used every single day, Craigslist. It was simple, almost charming in its minimalism. Just text, categories, locations. No glossy photos, no algorithms watching your every click. People went there to rent a room, find a date, post a job, sell an old couch. It felt harmless, even boring. But the simplicity of it all was what made it so easy for a predator to blend in. The erotic services section had always been controversial, yet it remained one of the most active parts of the platform. Young women, many of them students or struggling financially, posted short ads offering massages or companionship. Nothing dramatic, nothing unusual, a normal part of Craigslist's underground economy. But then, a new client appeared. He was polite, quick to respond, and insisted on meeting in upscale hotels, the kind of places where no one looks twice at a stranger walking down the hallway. No threats, no red flags, just another appointment in the calendar. What no one knew was that behind the screen sat a man who saw these women not as people, but as targets. His name was Philip Markoff, a medical student, tall, clean-cut, engaged to be married. The kind of man anyone would trust. The kind of man who could walk into a hotel room with a smile and walk out leaving only silence behind. And at first, there was nothing connecting the strange incidents that followed. A missing wallet here, a tied pair of hands there, a frightened woman who managed to escape but couldn't fully describe her attacker. It all felt like isolated events. Unsettling, but random. Craigslist was huge, after all. Incidents happened. People moved on. But investigators would later realize something chilling. The pattern had been there from the very beginning. Each meeting was scheduled the same way. Each room was chosen with precision. Each victim was picked from the same section of the site. And each encounter escalated just a little more. No one knew it yet, but a killer was already hunting, and Craigslist had become his perfect camouflage. The night of April 14, 2009 began just like dozens of appointments before it. A quiet hallway, a polished hotel door, a young woman preparing for what she thought was just another client. Her name was Julissa Brisman. She never imagined she was walking straight into a trap. Philip Markoff had chosen the location carefully. An upscale Boston hotel where he knew cameras were limited and staff didn't question guests. He walked in calmly, dressed neatly, carrying nothing suspicious. Anyone watching would have thought he was just another business traveler. But inside his jacket, he had a handgun and plastic restraints. Julissa welcomed him with a polite professional tone. Nothing felt wrong at first. No raised voice, no sudden movement, just a normal conversation in a small, quiet room. And then, everything changed. Markov pulled the gun, not shaking, not frantic, calm, cold, as if he had rehearsed this moment many times before. He ordered her to turn around, forced her hands behind her back, tied them with practiced ease. He moved like a man who knew exactly what he wanted. But Julissa didn't freeze. She fought. She struggled with every ounce of strength she had. And for the first time in his attacks, Markov lost control. The room filled with chaos, furniture scraping across the floor, fabric tearing, muffled screams. His ritual was breaking apart. Panic flashed across his face, something raw and unplanned. And then, in the struggle, a shot was fired. Julissa collapsed. The fight was over. Just minutes earlier, she had been sending messages, confirming her schedule, living an ordinary life. Now the room was silent, except for Markov's heavy breathing. He grabbed a few things, barely anything of value, and walked out the door. No rush, no frantic escape, just a steady, calculated exit. Down the hallway, into the elevator, out of the hotel, as if nothing had happened. But for the first time, his perfect plan wasn't perfect anymore. A witness had heard sounds. A worker had noticed someone unusual, walking too quickly. And in the chaos, he left something behind. Something small, something he didn't realize would lead detectives straight to him. Julissa's death was a tragedy, but it was also the beginning of the end, because Philip Markov had finally made a mistake. For days, Boston police sifted through fragments of a case that felt almost impossible to solve. A hotel room with barely any fingerprints, a hallway with limited camera coverage, a suspect who moved with the discipline of someone who understood forensic science. At first glance, Philip Markov looked like a ghost. But ghosts don't make mistakes. And Markov, for all his planning, left breadcrumbs. It started with a single shell casing, clean, polished, but traceable. Then came the surveillance footage, grainy, muted, but still showing a tall, confident man in a baseball cap walking with a familiar stride. Investigators replayed it again and again, comparing posture, clothing, gait. Little by little, the name Philip Markov began appearing on their screens. He wasn't a criminal. He wasn't unemployed. He wasn't desperate. He was a top medical student, engaged to be married, living in what looked like a perfect life. Nothing about him fit the profile of a violent predator, and yet, every clue pointed directly at him. Detectives dug deeper. They traced the emails used to schedule the hotel meetings. They checked the IP address. They followed a digital trail Markov never imagined could expose him. What looked anonymous wasn't. The more they uncovered, the clearer it became. Behind the polite messages and carefully chosen hotels was a man hiding a very dark obsession. When police finally pulled Markov's vehicle over, they expected panic, fear, some sign of guilt. Instead, he sat perfectly still, calm, almost emotionless, as if he believed he could talk his way out of anything. But once they searched his apartment, the mask shattered. Inside, police found everything: plastic restraints, guns, a stash of items belonging to past victims, a chilling collection that painted the real picture. A predator hiding in plain sight. His fiancée was stunned. His classmates were speechless. No one could reconcile the gentle, ambitious young man they knew with the violent criminal investigators described. The contrast was almost unbearable. Markov was arrested, charged, and placed under constant supervision. But even behind bars, he refused to give answers. He never confessed, never explained what drove him, never acknowledged the pain he caused. And then, before the trial could even begin, something happened that closed the case forever. On August 15, 2010, guards found Markov dead in his cell. He had taken his own life in a carefully planned act, leaving behind a scene as meticulous as his crimes. A final escape. A final silence. No motive, no full confession. No real understanding of what transformed a promising medical student into a killer. Only unanswered questions. And the chilling realization that evil can wear the most ordinary face. In October of 1994, the entire United States stopped and listened. A young mother from South Carolina, trembling in front of reporters, begged the nation to help her find her 2 missing sons. Her name was Susan Smith. And in those first desperate hours, America believed every word she said. With a shaking voice and tears streaming down her face, Susan claimed that a stranger had hijacked her car at a red light. She described him as a tall black man who forced her out of the vehicle and sped away, her children, Michael and Alex, still strapped into their car seats. It was a nightmare scenario, the kind that made every parent in the country hold their breath. Police mobilized instantly. Roadblocks, helicopters, volunteers searching through forests and lakes. The media broadcast her pleas across every channel, and each time Susan appeared on camera, eyes red, voice quivering, the sympathy grew. Neighbors hugged her. News anchors called the kidnapping senseless and horrifying. America felt united in heartbreak. But behind the cameras, something didn't feel right. Officers noticed inconsistencies in Susan's timeline. Her statements shifted in small ways. Not enough to accuse her, but enough to raise eyebrows. Some details felt rehearsed, others felt vague. And then there was the biggest red flag. The supposed kidnapper had vanished without a trace. Not a single witness, not a single camera, not a single person who saw a strange man speeding away in her car. Still, investigators held back. She was a grieving mother. Stress could explain the inconsistencies. Trauma could cloud memories. Nobody wanted to believe she could be lying, especially not about something this horrific. But then, something happened that shifted the tone of the entire investigation. A detective, listening carefully to Susan's latest retelling of the kidnapping, asked a simple question. One any mother should have been able to answer instantly. Which direction did the car go? And Susan froze, just for a moment, a flicker barely longer than a heartbeat. But in that silence, investigators felt something shift. The story that once united a nation in sympathy was beginning to crack at its edges. And deep beneath those cracks, a truth far darker than anyone imagined was waiting to be uncovered. For 9 long days, the search for Michael and Alex Smith consumed the entire state of South Carolina. News stations updated the story every hour. Volunteers combed through parks, lakes, and back roads. Parents held their children tighter. And through it all, Susan Smith stood at the center, crying, pleading, begging for answers. Or so it seemed. Investigators began to notice something unsettling. Susan's emotions turned on and off like a switch. One moment she was sobbing into a reporter's shoulder. The next she appeared strangely calm, even collected. And when detectives asked her to recreate the kidnapping route, she couldn't. Her story shifted again. Small details, but important ones. The timing, the traffic light, the exact spot where the stranger supposedly appeared. Piece by piece, the puzzle was starting to look wrong. And then came the moment investigators had been waiting for. Susan was asked to redrive the route she claimed the kidnapper took. She hesitated. Her hands trembled on the steering wheel, and halfway through the drive, she broke down. Not in grief, but in panic. She pulled the car to the side of the road and began sobbing uncontrollably. Detectives exchanged quiet glances. They had seen this before. The emotional collapse of someone whose story is beginning to crumble. When they gently pressed her again, she insisted she was telling the truth, but her eyes avoided theirs. Her voice cracked. Her breathing grew uneven, like a person carrying a secret too heavy to hold. At the sheriff's office, the pressure increased. They confronted her with the inconsistencies, the contradictions, the fact that no kidnapper existed in any witness report. Slowly, Susan's confident performance began to fade. Detectives later recalled a chilling moment when Susan sat alone in the interview room staring at the table, almost as if she were talking to herself, whispering, rehearsing. And still, she denied everything. But the turning point came from a detail she overlooked. Police examined the lake near her home, a lake she had mentioned only briefly, almost carelessly. And investigators noticed something strange. The tire tracks near the edge didn't match the story she told. They were fresh. Too fresh. Detectives confronted her again. This time they told her they knew she hadn't been honest. And as the room fell silent, Susan's facade finally shattered. Her shoulders slumped. Her breathing slowed. Tears filled her eyes, not like before, not performed, but heavy, terrified, and real. She whispered 4 words that ended the search instantly and changed the story forever. I didn't do it. The truth was coming, and it was far darker than the lie. The interview room had grown painfully quiet. Detectives sat still, watching the young mother in front of them unravel. Susan Smith wiped her face with shaking hands, her breath catching in her throat. For 9 days she had carried the lie with confidence, but the weight of the truth was finally too much. When detectives asked her again what happened, her voice broke. It wasn't the dramatic wailing she showed the cameras. It was soft, fragile, almost childlike. She whispered, "I wasn't carjacked." The officers leaned forward, her hands twisted together tightly as if she were begging them to stop time. Then came the confession that shattered the nation. "I let the car roll into the lake." The room fell silent, a heavy, suffocating silence that felt impossible to breathe in. Susan cried harder, the truth spilling out in broken sentences. She said she felt overwhelmed. She said she wasn't thinking clearly. She said she believed her life was falling apart. But no explanation, no matter how desperate, could soften what she'd done. Her 2 sons, Michael and Alex, were still inside the car as it sank beneath the dark water. Detectives later described the confession as one of the most devastating moments of their careers. Not anger, not shock, but a profound, hollow grief filled the room. A grief that came from realizing every moment of hope, every search party, every vigil lit by neighbors, had been built on a lie. The recovery team moved quickly that night. When divers located the car submerged in the lake, the scene became one of the most heartbreaking in South Carolina's history. Underwater lights revealed the truth in slow, floating shapes. A small vehicle resting on the lake bed, 2 tiny figures still buckled in their seats. A sight so tragic that seasoned officers had to look away. News of the confession spread across the country before dawn. People who had prayed for the boys' safe return woke up to an ending they could barely comprehend. Neighbors cried on their porches. Reporters struggled to maintain composure. The collective heartbreak was overwhelming, and yet, beneath the grief, another emotion began to rise: outrage. How could a mother do this? How could she mislead the entire nation? How could she play the role of the grieving parent while knowing exactly where her children were? The betrayal felt personal, intimate, cruel. Susan Smith was arrested and charged with 2 counts of murder. During the trial, psychologists debated her mental state, prosecutors dissected her lies, and the public watched every moment with a mix of horror and disbelief. But ultimately, her actions spoke louder than any explanation. She was sentenced to life in prison, with the possibility of parole after 30 years, a decision that sparked anger across the country. To this day, the case remains one of the most painful and polarizing tragedies in American criminal history, not just because of the crime itself, but because Susan Smith had convinced millions to share in a hope that she knew had died the very first night. A reminder that sometimes the most haunting monsters are the ones who smile through tears. Boston, early 1960s. It was a city that usually fell asleep to the quiet hum of streetcars and the distant echo of harbor horns. But now, something darker was spreading through its neighborhoods. Something silent. Something that made even the bravest people double-check the locks twice before going to bed. Women were being found murdered inside their own homes. Each scene looked painfully similar. The same method, the same unsettling precision, as if the killer moved with rehearsed confidence. Police officers whispered among themselves that whoever he was, he left almost nothing behind. No fingerprints, no noise, no witnesses. It was as if he slipped in and out like a shadow. People started calling him the Boston Strangler, and the name stuck to the city like cold fog. Walking through Boston at night became a test of nerves. Curtains never stayed open, windows never stayed unlocked. A stranger at the door could make your heart jump out of your chest. Some residents joked nervously, trying to hide their fear, but the laughter never lasted long. Newspapers printed bold headlines almost every week. Another victim, another apartment, another woman who thought she was safe, and the terrifying pattern became impossible to ignore. The killer was calm, methodical, almost eerily patient. Detectives held grim press conferences, their faces tired, their voices shaking ever so slightly. They knew the truth, even if they didn't say it aloud. The city was dealing with someone highly intelligent and completely without mercy. Someone who understood vulnerability and exploited it. Parents refused to let their daughters walk alone. Neighbors who had shared cups of coffee for years suddenly looked at each other with suspicion. A simple knock on the door could freeze a person in place, and Boston wasn't just scared. It was paranoid. And through all this fear, the killer continued to move. Quiet. Unseen. Leaving behind rooms that felt strangely staged. Almost ritualistic. As if every horrible detail had a purpose only he understood. By the winter of '62, one thing became painfully clear. No one knew where he would strike next. And the uncertainty was worse than the crime scenes themselves. The city of Boston had become a place where silence felt dangerous. Where every night brought the same heavy question. Who will he choose now? This was the beginning of the terror. A season of fear that wrapped itself around the city like a cold, unshakable shadow, and refused to let go. When Albert DeSalvo first walked into the interrogation room, no one expected him to change the entire direction of the Boston Strangler investigation. He wasn't there for murder. He had been arrested for a string of break-ins and disturbing but non-fatal assaults. A criminal, yes, but nothing close to a notorious serial killer. Still, there was something unsettling about the way he carried himself. Calm, controlled, almost eager to talk. Then, one day, without warning, he made a statement that stunned detectives. "I'm the one you're looking for." He confessed. Not to one killing, not even to a few, but to all of the Boston Strangler murders. The room fell silent. Detectives exchanged glances of disbelief, and why would a man already facing charges suddenly claim responsibility for crimes that would surely destroy him? At first, DeSalvo's confession seemed shockingly detailed. He described scenes that had never been publicly released. He outlined the killer's routine, the method, even the way the victims' apartments looked. It felt like he had been there. But the longer investigators listened, the more something didn't add up. He misplaced dates. He confused the order of victims. He described layouts of apartments that didn't match reality. Sometimes he remembered too much, almost like he was repeating a story he'd practiced rather than lived. Detectives began to whisper behind closed doors. Was he the real killer? Or was he chasing attention? Fame? A twisted form of immortality? His own lawyer hinted that DeSalvo might be hoping for a book deal or media spotlight. Others believed he simply wanted to be remembered, even for horror. And in the middle of this confusing storm, the police were stuck with a man who talked a lot, but offered no physical evidence. No fingerprints, no DNA. Nothing concrete tying him to the crime scenes. Yet when he spoke, his voice was steady, his tone almost proud. He described the murders with a disturbing lack of emotion, and as if recounting someone else's story that he'd memorized too well. The public didn't know what to believe. Some were relieved the strangler had been caught. Others felt a chill, sensing that something in this confession didn't feel right. Was this really the monster who had terrorized Boston, or an imposter who stepped forward because the real killer was clever enough to stay hidden? As investigators dug deeper, their doubts only grew stronger. And soon, the entire case would spiral into a mystery that still lingers like a shadow over Boston's darkest history.
Albert DeSalvo's confession shook Boston,
but the trial that followed shook it even more. Courtrooms filled every day with reporters, sketch artists, and curious onlookers. Every headline screamed the same thing: the Boston Strangler has been caught. But behind the confident tone of the newspapers, investigators whispered a different story. DeSalvo wasn't even being tried for the stranglings. There simply wasn't enough evidence. So instead, prosecutors pushed forward with unrelated charges: breaking and entering, assault, anything they could prove. And through it all, DeSalvo sat in silence, calm, almost detached. Too calm, some thought. And rumors spread that he was bargaining behind the scenes. Some believed he wanted fame. Others said he hoped for better conditions in prison. And a few believed he had been coached, that someone had fed him information. The trial became a spectacle. Bright cameras, loud accusations, and an uncomfortable truth lurking in the background. No physical evidence connected DeSalvo to the murders. Even his own family begged the public to question the story. They insisted he wasn't violent. Troubled, yes, but not a monster. Then, without warning, the case hit an irreversible turning point. In 1973, Albert DeSalvo was found stabbed to death in prison, killed by someone who never revealed why. Some said it was a dispute with other inmates. Others whispered it was a silencing, that DeSalvo knew something he shouldn't. And with his death, every unanswered question froze in time. Boston breathed a strange mixture of relief and dread. On paper, the case was solved, but in living rooms, detective offices, and late-night conversations, people admitted the truth. No one really knew whether DeSalvo was the Boston Strangler, or just a troubled man who stepped into a spotlight that never belonged to him. His confession explained some things, and contradicted many others. His behavior fit the profile, and yet somehow didn't. The deeper investigators looked, the thicker the fog became. Was the real Strangler still out there? Had he blended back into ordinary life, or had he died long before DeSalvo ever whispered a word? No one could say for sure. And so the story ends not with justice, but with a cold, lingering uncertainty. A case closed on paper,
but open in the minds of everyone who lived through those terrifying nights. The truth, like the Boston fog, stayed low to the ground, dense, cold, and refusing to lift.
And that brings us to the end of tonight's journey. A journey through 3 lives, 3 tragedies, and 3 shadows that stretched far beyond the moments they were born from. Philip Markoff, Susan Smith, and the mystery of the Boston Strangler. Different people, different stories, but each one a reminder of how fragile our understanding of others can be. How the face someone shows the world can hide truths darker than we imagine. And as we look back at these cases, one thing becomes painfully clear. Evil doesn't always appear with warning. Sometimes it moves quietly, disguised as the ordinary. A student, a parent, a neighbor, and sometimes the real answers never surface at all. If you found this documentary meaningful, or if it made you think, please leave a like. It helps more than you know. And if you want to dive deeper into true crime, unsolved mysteries, and hidden histories, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. There are many more stories to tell, and I'd love to have you with me for the next one. Thank you for watching. Stay safe and stay curious. Good night.